am Anne Marie from Teacher to Teacher Help. In this video, I'm going to share a mini grammar unit that you can use to deepen your students' understanding of particular grammar and convention skills. The mini unit that I'm going to share with you is using the method of instruction called inquiry. Now, I first learned about using inquiry for teaching grammar and conventions from these two books, The Power of Grammar by Mary Aaronworth and Vicki Vinton, and A Fresh Approach to Teaching Punctuation by Janet Angelillo. Before I share the unit with you, I'd like to walk you through the steps that you take when you are using inquiry for investigating a grammar convention. So step one is to just introduce the convention to your students. Just tell them what it is. Step two is to help students find examples of that convention. Then what you want to do is notice and name patterns and actually chart these out, discuss the purpose of it, how this convention affects the text or the reader. Then together you decide on a generalization that fits the pattern that you noticed. And then the next two steps are to find other examples just in your daily reading. And then the most important step is to try using it in your own writing. So I thought I would share with you an example of how I did this in my classroom. And I'm going to use the convention of apostrophes, but you can apply this to any grammar or language convention that you're noticing your students are struggling with. So and I guess that's a key that I should point out. You want it to be assessment based. So I'm not just randomly picking this skill. I chose this skill because I noticed that my students were using but confusing, using but misusing, using but overusing. I always say when they're doing one of those things, they are approximating. That's the sweet spot for learning. So I started noticing this across my entire class. So let me show you an example. This was one of my students, Allie, and she had just written this piece in her writer's notebook. And I have gone through and just marked off all the places where she used apostrophes. And you'll notice that she used them multiple times, and every single time it was incorrect. And there were different reasons for her incorrect use of apostrophes here. But I was noticing this across my class, and I decided that we should do one of these investigations. Now, I decided to call it apostrophe detectives, just to make it more engaging. So what I started out by doing was introducing the convention to students and then inviting them one day at the end of independent reading time during our reading workshop. I said, I want you to go back through the reading that you just did today and see if you can find some examples of words that have apostrophes in them. Now, I didn't do any teaching around this. I just introduced them to the apostrophe. And these are examples of a couple of students who found these words in their books. And I just said, find the word, write it down, and then write down the word of the phrase where you notice that word being used. And that's all we did first. We just collected. So then the next thing we did was brought all of those together and discussed them, and we did some noticing. So on chart paper, I said, what did you notice about apostrophes? And these are some of the things that the students said. They said, well, if someone owns something, you need an apostrophe. They said, when you want to put two words together to make one word, you need an apostrophe. And then someone said, well, if an apostrophe isn't there, the word won't be what you want it to be. So I just wrote down simply whatever students noticed. Then we started to take it a step further and try to come up with some generalizations. Now, the generalizations that they were able to come up with from the examples that we collected were sometimes it shows ownership and sometimes it's used in a contraction. So two different ways that we might use apostrophes. Now, I would add here a third thing that I could have done is shown examples of plural possessives, not just singular possessives, not just singular ownership. I chose to only do these two categories because these were the examples that the students found. But I wanted to point out that if your students found those other examples, you definitely want to teach into that as well. So the next thing I did was read to my students this book, The Greedy Apostrophe. And I did this because it's a very engaging book. I wanted them to just have a little bit of fun with this, and you'll see what we did at the end of it. So in this book, if you're not familiar with it, this is the story of how all of the punctuation marks were given their jobs, and they had to take an oath. On my honor, I will promise to work with words, phrases, and sentences to make their meanings clear. I promise to uphold the rules of punctuation and always to help readers, never confuse them. Well, all of the punctuation marks took the oath except for one. The one that refused to take the oath was the apostrophe. He was the greedy apostrophe. He said, "Gruels, schmules, you've got it all wrong. It's more fun to confuse readers, not help them." So on the subsequent pages, you see the greedy apostrophe putting himself into all kinds of places that he doesn't belong. You'll see him in schools, you'll see him in stores. And again, what I'm doing here is heightening my students' awareness to the improper use of these punctuation marks. So after we got finished with the entire book, it ends, well, at the end of the book, it ends with really a call to action. So as you go through, you see all of these places where the greedy apostrophe is putting himself in places he doesn't belong. And then at the end, here's the call to action. It says, the author says, "And so, dear reader, you must be watchful. You must take him away from any plurals that are not rightfully his. And once and for all, the greedy apostrophe must be removed." So I chose to use that as a call to action for my students. I said, let's go through our own writing folders, our own writer's notebooks, and see where we have used apostrophes. And let's see if we see any greedy apostrophes in there, any places where the apostrophe should not be. This is one of the most common spelling errors, even for adults, that they use apostrophes when it should just be a plural noun, not a singular or plural possessive. So I wanted students to start noticing that in their own writing. But again, to continue to heighten their awareness, I invited them to go out into the world and just start noticing. So you notice that this is not just a one-day lesson. This became something that we wove into just the thread of our conversations each day. So it started out with this little unit, but then it continued. So we collected signs. I invited students to take pictures, and of course I brought some pictures in as well. These are just a couple of examples. And it's not something that is a quick fix. Using apostrophes correctly is something they're going to need practice with. But starting out with that inquiry and introducing them to the convention, starting to notice and name and see these patterns. So they're coming up with a generalization. That still doesn't mean that they can use it, but by gradually taking them through this process and heightening their awareness, eventually I noticed that students started using it correctly, not using but confusing or using but overusing, but actually using correctly in their daily writing. And even students who didn't do that right away, we had this whole anchor experience to draw on. And I could say, remember, now is that the apostrophe doing his job, or is that the greedy apostrophe creeping back in? So this is just an example of one way that you could use inquiry to teach your students highlight something that they're really struggling with. So I invite you to try out this mini unit, but then really what I invite you to do is see where your students need to do some inquiry around some other language convention, and you can follow the same exact process.